so that they can bring the changes that we need in every sector of our life. Thank you, sir.
Very briefly, my question echoes what Perta and Mimi said. Are we using the right role model, right reference points and models? There's a time there was a strapline called BRICS, and I believe the S in the BRICS was South Africa. What lessons can we learn from South Africa having been identified as a key powerhouse in terms of economic growth?
Thank you very much. My name is Dennis Aguma. I was born in Uganda. Two questions. One, basically both of them are about the chicken and egg situation. You mentioned demographic challenges. Africa has a very young population, which should be a very good thing. But of course, when you have more mouths to feed, then the resources are distributed. Which one is better? The second question was about infrastructure. For some time now, particularly in Uganda, I have noticed that there's a lot of money being spent on infrastructure projects, roads, energy. They've taken a huge share of the budgets, and sometimes at a huge repayment of these of debts. Is it the right course? Do you take the bullet and invest in these kind of projects and end up suffocating your long-term strategic plans because there's no money left to do anything else other than to pay debt? Which do you deal with first? Thank you.
Thank you very much, so we'll start with.
Yeah, I think I'll probably leave a little more time for my colleagues because I'll have an opportunity actually to address a good number of these questions in my keynote. By the way, you would be surprised about how much progress has been made in the last 2 decades. Sometimes we do not pay attention to what's going on. Who would imagine that there are 2 countries of high income category in Africa? Do you know any? We do have. No, it's not even this one. Anyway, this is part of what I'll keep for my presentation. I'm really curious to know whether that is high in terms of GDP per capita, taking inequality into account as well. This is GDP per capita beyond 12,500 per capita. Well, there are almost 30 countries in middle income status, and this is up from 13 about a decade and a half ago. Stay tuned on that. Second, who knows the fact that Africa is a net lender to the rest of the world? You know that? And it is true. When you take our foreign reserves, we as countries keep them in government paper in UK, government paper in US. Usually around 60% is in the United States. We do finance American government activities. While we borrow quite expensively to finance activities. These are some of the key questions that we need to start focusing on. But anyway, as I said, stay tuned.
Yeah, I hope you're all learning the art of the teaser from Professor. It's really impressive. On the group of questions, there was a group of questions on corruption. So I'm not an expert, although I've read a lot about it. It was one of my fascinating questions. And what is that these countries that we were referred to in the small introduction, the East Asian countries, although I rejected the idea of being compared to these countries, my rebellious nature, but they didn't have much lower corruption levels when they started off at the time. And so there's a number of works that have been done on the nature of corruptions that exists in an economy and its level of damage to growth. And a lot of the thinkers, including very recognized one, Nicholas North had a Nobel Prize for it, and you have Khan, for instance, at the SOAS, who works a lot on these issues, that characterizes, for instance, the corruption activities that are related to rent protections, and that can be harmful to the economy. And then you have the type of grease the wheel connection that can be of different nature. Danny Roderick, one of my professors, also worked on it. So I really encourage to look at well, I mean, I can develop more, but to look at the literature and see what type of corruption we're talking about. Obviously, we all, in terms of citizens, we all hate to be subjected to corruption, but in terms of economic efficiency, that's another discussion. On the infrastructure question, is it worth the cost? Actually, I'm looking very closely at the capex number in the African budgets. So the capital expenditure versus the current expenditure is very low. So still, a bulk of our budgets in Africa are dedicated to paying civil servants, to paying interest and debt, to paying subsidies, goods and services spending. And what happens to capex is, at the beginning of the budget year, they are budgeted to be, let's say, a third of the budget. And then at the end of the year, because we have overestimated the budget revenues, we have to slash the capex, and they end up not being done, or we end up running arrears to the suppliers, and so we're not doing them. So I don't think we're overspending on capex, on capital expenditure and infrastructure, far from it. So I think we can do more. And then there's the question of infrastructure efficiency, for which you have to wait for Professor Ndulu's keynote.
Thankfully, we actually do have two distinguished keynote speakers. Apart from Professor Ben, we also have Professor, I call him Nkube. I know that's not the right way to pronounce it, I'm sorry, but he's also a distinguished economist, and we are actually quite privileged to have these two people giving keynotes this afternoon. So if you do have questions, there will be questions and answers after their keynote addresses as well, and that would be lovely. So I'll hand over to Okendo to also say his bit, and obviously with the idea of looking forward at some problems.
God, well, thank you. Professor, maybe you want to give us a teaser later. Well, thank you for that. I've had the privilege in the last few months of serving as the Africa advisor to Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Zuckerberg, with the Ken Zuckerberg Initiative. And it's been fascinating to see how, and I know Mark is kind of controversial at this university, but it's pretty lightly here. But one of the fascinating things has been working with someone who has connected 2 billion people over 10 years. Has been really to see the kind of attitude that you must have if you're going to do something of that import, that great things. And for me, one of the things I've really come to learn from seeing Mark and Priscilla at work has been that the lesson for me has been that if you're going to succeed, you must give yourself permission to fail. And that to me means that we have to, as we think about the challenges that we face, I don't think that we should think about them as failures, but as lessons. What are the lessons that we've gotten from the governance challenges that we've had over the last few years? And how can we take those lessons and apply them and learn from them? And it's important, I think, to reframe this nature of corruption, partly because, you know, with Rambeg, the premise is that we try to encourage folks to actually go back to power and start companies. And I remember 10 years ago when we began our journey, who was part of that initial class, can attest to this. People would just kept saying, well, I'll go back, but there's so much corruption, there's so much no infrastructure, maybe I'll just sit here and pray and somehow, someday it will get done. Well, it will not get done unless we make it happen. It will not get done unless we roll up our sleeve and figure out how to get this education of folks. And for so long, I've just seen these things as excuses. People would simply sit around saying, well, there's corruption, so I am absolved from any responsibility. I will just pray and comply. And I think we have to understand that, no, these are important lessons. We are learning them, and I think what's happening in Zimbabwe right now begins to show us some of the lessons. I mean, my understanding is that both parties understand that they definitely don't want to repeat what happened, and they're trying to rise to the occasion. And so I think how we think about this is important. How we reframe it, I think it's so important what you mentioned, that we've got to
responded to the question, but I'm curious whether you also want to leave us with some forward-looking statements. Do you?
Well, first I have to be an optimist for my job because I invest money. So if I'm not an optimist, I'm screwed. Because I just invest money in a lot of African countries, and then if I'm a pessimist, that's it. So I'm an optimist. I think there's a lot going on. Dr. Abuzi was mentioning a lot of the good things happening on the continent. But I think that there is policy innovation that is worth looking into. So basically, all what we're talking about in terms of innovation, we're talking about new technologies and phones and social media. There's also a lot of policy innovation. People are learning to do government more, and I can observe it from my point of view on the private sector. Some of the governments with whom I've worked with 10 years ago are not working the same way. Sometimes because there was an administration change, sometimes because there was one division head that went back, got the right training, brought in the right people, and then is changing the division. A central bank is changing, a ministry of infrastructure. So a lot of things are happening also in policy design in many countries that are giving me a lot of reasons to be optimistic, among other things.
Okay. Mr. Bello says he would save his speech for the end. And I'm actually quite glad that other panels in this conference sort of complement some of our discussions here today. Okendo did mention the fact